Welcome to the Underline This podcast, the podcast where we unpack the big ideas hiding in the margins because the best parts, they're between the lines. Today, we have an especially exciting agenda planned out. We're going to talk about All Quiet on the Western Front. A sales pitch for peace is what I like to call it. If there's one book that has truly sold me on the idea of peace, it's All Quiet on the Western Front by Erich Maria Remarque. Now, to unpack this, I'll start with some background on the author, explore the historical context of World War I. We'll break down key themes and symbolism. We'll compare the Netflix adaptation to the original novel. And of course, we'll finish with my personal takeaways. To kick things off, let's talk about our author. Erich Maria Remarque, born Erich Paul Remarque on June 22, 1899 in Osnabrück, Germany, came from a working-class Catholic family. At the age of 18, he was drafted into the German army and wounded several times on the front lines. All Quiet on the Western Front essentially is a fictionalized memoir of his experiences, what he saw, his thoughts, his impressions, him processing what was going on around him, and really his deep disillusionment with the war. Now, this book was published in 1928 through 1929 and really quickly became an international bestseller as a powerful anti-war novel. It was so impactful that prior to World War II, when the Nazis came to power, they actually banned it. And this was one of those books that would be tossed on the banned book list fire that they would have at their rallies. It was labeled as unpatriotic due to its anti-war message. Now, due to Nazi hostility, which most of us would agree is a badge of honor, Remarque fled Germany for Switzerland and later became a United States citizen. And Nazi propaganda even falsely labeled him as Jewish in an attempt to try and discredit his work during that era. Now, tragically, his sister Elfriede Schultz was executed by the Nazi regime for undermining morale. Now, throughout his career, Remarque published several other notable works, including The Road Back, Three Comrades, Art of Triumph, The Black Obelisk, Heaven Has No Favorites, and The Night in Lisbon. He died on September 25th, 1970 in Locarno, Switzerland, but his legacy lived on, especially through All Quiet on the Western Front, as one of the most influential anti-war voices in literature. Now, when I think of books, sometimes I like to think that there are multiple authors, whether it be an experience, an event, or big influences in the author's life. Now, in the context and scope of All Quiet on the Western Front, I would say that World War I and those experiences that Remarque had were that co-author of the story. Remarque paints it really with a lot of vivid imagery, and I felt like I was wearing a VR headset, witnessing the misery of trench warfare firsthand. He really did an excellent job of just talking about how miserable that experience must have been. So in order to talk about World War I, I'd like to set the stage, give some historical context, and also do my part to try and fill in the details and highlight on some of the things that Remarque himself talks about in his book. So let's set the stage. The war began with the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary while visiting Sarajevo. Have a hard time pronouncing that. And Austria essentially blamed Serbia and declared war. As a result, Russia supported Serbia. Germany backed Austria. France joined Russia. Germany invaded neutral Belgium to get to France, which then brought the United Kingdom into the conflict. And eventually, the United States and over 30 nations were pulled into a fiery chain reaction like dominoes doused in gasoline, leading to a global explosion. Now, the war lasted from 1914 to 1918 and was historically unique for several reasons. It was the first war involving industrialized warfare, making it the first truly modern war in world history. This was the introduction to machine guns, tanks, poison gas, airplanes, submarines. Trench warfare really defined the Western Front and created a static, brutal battlefield. And if you look at aerial images and images of what trench warfare looked like, it almost looks like scars that have just been carved out of the ground. And as I mentioned before, the living conditions were really horrific. In the trenches, it was muddy, it was wet, there were rats, lice, corpses and the constant shelling and attacks from the enemy. Sadly, World War I resulted in 16 million deaths and over 20 million wounded. Now, just to try and emphasize how many lives that is, that would be the equivalent of modern day New York City being wiped out twice. Now, the war ended on November 11th, 1918, when Germany signed an armistice. Now, and the Treaty of Versailles, which was signed and enacted in 1919, placed full blame and heavy reparations on Germany, which caused resentment and would eventually fuel World War II. Now that we've talked about our authors and the history of World War I, let's talk about the story, All Quiet on the Western Front. Our protagonist, the main character, is Paul Baumer, a young German soldier who enlists with his friends following graduation, and they joined the German military because they were misled by their nationalistic teachers and a false sense of glory. Their excitement quickly turns from seeing fighting in the war as this adventure to really what it was, a horrific reality of trench warfare and death, suffering, and desensitization to the horrors of war. And one of the quotes that stood out to me about this story, actually I'll share just talking about this situation where Paul and his friends, they're inspired, they're passionate about serving their country and going to fight. And when they realize the reality of it, I thought this quote actually did a very good job of communicating what that whole experience. So I'll go ahead and read it. The book says, "We loved our country as much as they. We went courageously into every action, but we had learned to see." Now, sadly, throughout the novel, Paul's friends die one by one, and the pain becomes so much, he eventually becomes numb. And when he goes home on leave, he feels disconnected from the old world, the world that he came from. And really, nobody can understand or relate to what he's experienced or endured. Now, spoiler alert, if you don't want to get any spoilers, fast forward ahead. But in the end, Paul dies quietly on a day when the front is unusually calm. An army report on that day reads, "All quiet on the Western Front." All right, now let's talk about some of the themes from this book. The first one is war is hell. Now, I know that sounds like a cliche. You hear it in every war movie, book, series, but it's 100% true. There's no better or more concise way of saying it. War truly is hell. And the book reinforces this. And Remarque does an excellent job of just showing that war is a place where misery thrives and death is a tool of power. And it's Paul's experiences, and through Paul's experiences, he's constantly soaked in mud, blood, decay, and fear. Now, the second theme that I want to highlight is the absurdity and futility of war. Now, World War I cost millions of lives. If you remember, there were 16 million lives lost and 20 million individuals that were wounded. Now, for that cost of millions of lives and millions of people wounded, it was really just a few miles of land that were acquired during the fight of the war for that territory. And in battles like the Somme, Verdun, and Passchendaele, over 1 million casualties were lost for just a couple kilometers of territorial gain. Just imagine a giant game of tug of war where you got millions of soldiers on both sides, and you're losing on these people really just to gain about an inch. And in the end, what really caused the end of this war was that Germany had exhausted all the resources. They had no more. They got to the point where their military could not support itself, and they were forced into submission. Now, the third theme I'd like to highlight is loss of innocence. Now, I talked earlier before that Paul and his classmates, while they should have been starting off life fresh out of high school and getting an education and deciding what their purpose in the world might be and going on dates and having a very typical post high school college experience, they are thrown into the most raw and difficult and painful scenarios known to man, which is war. And not just any war, but the first modern war. And instead of doing all these things that are typical for, and I'd argue that they are men, but they're basically children, they're taught to kill or be killed, and their youth is stolen by war. And in the book, it says, I am young, I'm 20 years old, yet I know nothing of life but despair, death, fear, cast over an abyss of sorrow. The war has ruined us for everything. And it's really sad to read those words and also see the story, because that is truly what happened to Paul and his friends. They went into it with false ideas, a fantasy that this would just be an added adventure where they'd get stories to tell in the future. But really, they were traumatized and abused by the war itself. Now, for the second to last theme, I want to talk about armchair soldiers versus real soldiers. It is very easy to just kind of sit back and talk about something as if you're an expert, to give your opinion, which you're entitled to. But your perspective is going to change significantly, especially when you're the one that's being directly impacted. And in this book, there's a strong disconnect between those who fight and those who send others to fight. And I think it's so interesting that when Paul goes back home, he has a experience which I think is very relevant to today, which is that when we talk about war, we look at it very trivially, and we give our takes and say, yeah, it would be a benefit if we did this or if this happened. But the scary thing about talking about topics, especially related to war, is that there's a lot of lives. There's a lot of misery that goes into those little gains, which, if you want to call them gains. And in this book, and also in the film, which we'll unpack here in a moment, that's exactly what I mean. This is, you see people and military leaders send these young men out to fight, and in the end, very little is gained. And there's another quote that I really like that says, "It is very queer that the unhappiness of the world is so often brought on by small men." And you think about that, it really is true. I mean, look at World War II, for example. Hitler was the mastermind and influenced so many people to commit horrible atrocities, and all started with that small little man. And that's what happens here, is you've got armchair soldiers versus real soldiers. You got those that are putting themselves on the line. They're the ones sacrificing their lives, their minds, and their futures for the sake of others. The last thing I want to talk about is the psychological toll. Now, war doesn't end when the shooting stops. Paul and others are mentally scarred when they go on leave to go visit their families. That's very clear. Their suffering is truly incomprehensible. And that mental scarring at the time was called shell shock, which we all know today is PTSD. And a perfect comparison, I think, with just talking about the psychological toll that soldiers go through is captured in Rudyard Kipling's poem Boots, which captures the mental grind and fear of soldiers on endless marches. I highly recommend looking this one up. I was originally going to read out the whole poem, but I'm only going to talk about, I'm just going to talk about bits and pieces of it. But when you read the book, it takes place and was written within the context of the Boers War, when the British Army was marching on South Africa. And the poem has this tempo that's being set by the word boots, 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 boots. And it's the majority of the poem is actually just the stanza boots. And in between that tempo, there are these little snippets of the madness that goes on within a soldier's mind, such as try to think of something different. Oh my God, keep me from going lunatic. And it's a really dark poem. And the reason why I say it's so dark is because it captures the monotony of being a soldier, but also just the fact that as you are marching, you're marching towards danger. You're marching towards what could be your death. You're marching towards fighting and killing others. And it just, there's a lot to process in the short stanzas. And this is probably one of the most powerful poems that I've ever read. I know that there's a lot out there, but this is one that I think is just, it's truly terrifying to read. And if I think about it too long, it freaks me out. So I highly recommend looking at the poem Boots by Rudyard Kipling. Now let's talk about the Netflix adaptation versus the book. In preparation for this book, I watched the movie, and it is a very well done and powerful reinterpretation. The big difference between the two is that the book focuses on Paul's inner thoughts, which, in most movies we don't get that. We don't get the thoughts. We just kind of get an outsider's perspective as to what's going on from the point of view of the character. Now in the book, it's the same, except for we're actually getting an explicit look at Paul's thoughts. So we're hearing what's going on in his mind as he's witnessing what's happening around him. And the film also adds a political subplot and new characters for dramatic contrast. So for example, Matthias Matthias Erzberger by Daniel Bruhl shows the politics behind the war's end. So that's not in the book. In the movie, you do have these different plots going on. So you do have this politician, again, Matthias Erzberger, who's negotiating with the French and speaking with German generals and trying to negotiate peace. You also have General Friedrich, who's not in the book, but represents those commanders who are individuals that are behind the scenes who throw others' lives away while they themselves are not at the front. And if you heard the song Fortunate Son, I think that Matthias Erzberger and General Friedrich, they are the ones that definitely fall within that camp of people that were privileged enough not to be sent on the front lines. Now, at the very end, Paul's death in the film occurs minutes before the armistice, but in the book, his death happens at the end of the armistice, just minutes before the armistice, which just heightens the tragedy. And although there's a lot of details that differ, both versions remain really powerful because they have strong anti-war narratives, and they do such an excellent job of just really taking someone who's never experienced war before and putting them in the front lines and developing an understanding of what soldiers see and feel and what their experiences are. And this book is really intimate and reflective, and the film is extremely intense and visceral, and both are worth experiencing. So let's talk about takeaways. Like I mentioned before, Remarque, he has sold me on peace. The story's final note, where Paul dies in the end, I think makes for a very bold and haunting ending, which is that we're watching all the misery, all the pain that he's experiencing, and in the end, he himself, even though he's a protagonist, he dies. Now, All Quiet on the Western Front is not just a novel. It really is a warning that war is truly soul-crushing. It can be senseless and extremely inhumane. So this book, I like to think about it and call it, is the ultimate sales pitch for peace. And it succeeded. And I highly recommend it. This is a 4.5 out of 5. I understand why we read it in high school, because war is hell. It's something that should be an absolute last resort. And we should be asking questions, especially if we're the ones being pulled into a conflict and we're the ones that are sacrificing our lives. So thank you for listening. Please hit subscribe for this video to get more content, and we'll see you next time. Thanks, everyone.